Hello everyone, and welcome to Reading with Mrs. Adams. I'm Mrs. Adams, and today I have 3 stories and 3 poems all about pumpkins. Let's begin with a poem. It's called 5 Little Pumpkins. 5 little pumpkins sitting on a gate. The first one said, "Oh my, it's getting late." The second one said, "There are bats in the air." The third one said, "But we don't care." The fourth one said, "Let's run and run and run." The fifth one said, "I'm ready for some fun." Then whoo went the wind, and out went the lights, and the 5 little pumpkins rolled out of sight. That was fun. I hope you enjoyed it too. Our first story, boys and girls, is called The Biggest Pumpkin Ever. It's written by Stephen Kroll and illustrated by Jenny Bassett. It's about 2 mice who fell in love with the same pumpkin, and they each had a dream for that pumpkin. So in this case, teamwork makes 2 dreams work. Let's find out how their pumpkin became the biggest pumpkin ever. The Biggest Pumpkin Ever by Stephen Kroll, illustrated by Jenny Bassett. The Biggest Pumpkin Ever. The Biggest Pumpkin Ever by Stephen Kroll, illustrated by Jenny Bassett. For Nina Kaufman, S.K. For R.B.L., A Little Seed Grows Large, J.B. Once there were 2 mice who fell in love with the same pumpkin. Clayton, the house mouse, noticed it one day in the vegetable garden. It was still little and green, but Clayton thought he could make it grow really big. It might even get big enough to win the grand prize at the town pumpkin contest. Desmond, the field mouse, discovered the pumpkin the same day. He thought that if he helped it grow, it could become the biggest jack-o'-lantern in the neighborhood. That afternoon, Clayton watered the pumpkin. He also mixed up some fertilizer of manure and water. He spread the mixture around the pumpkin to make it grow larger. That very same night, Desmond went into the garden. He watered the pumpkin too. He also spread some manure mixed with water around it. The next day, Clayton watered and fertilized the pumpkin again. The next night, Desmond did the same. And the pumpkin began to grow. By the end of a month, the pumpkin was so large, Clayton couldn't believe his eyes. "My goodness," said Clayton's mother, "and it's not even full grown." Clayton shrugged. "All I do is water it," he said. Clayton's mother whispered in his ear. "If you want the pumpkin to grow bigger, faster," she said, "you should use sugar water." That night, Desmond brought his brother Morris to see the pumpkin. Morris knew everything there was to know about growing things. "That's some pumpkin," he said. Desmond shrugged. "All I do is water it," he said. Morris whispered in his ear. "You should try using sugar water," he said. The next day, Clayton dug a small hole beside the pumpkin vine. In the hole, he placed a bowl full of sugar water. He cut into the vine a few inches from the pumpkin. In the cut, he put one end of a piece of candle wick. Then he put the other end in the bowl of sugar water. That night, on the other side of the pumpkin, Desmond did exactly the same thing. Within a week, the pumpkin was twice the size it had been. Within 2 weeks, it was absolutely enormous. Clayton was amazed. He ran down the road and peeked into his friend Jimmy's pumpkin patch. The pumpkin Jimmy was growing for the contest looked much smaller. Clayton scratched his head. "I have an amazing pumpkin," he said out loud, "and I think I'm going to win the contest." That night, Desmond and his brother Morris spent a long time looking at the pumpkin. "How do you think it got that big?" Desmond asked. Morris shrugged. "A little luck, a little skill." "It's going to make some jack-o'-lanterns," said Desmond. "It sure is," said Morris. A week later, Clayton noticed the pumpkin was bigger than the family car. During the day, everyone he knew came to admire it. And at night, all the field mice gathered round to do the same. By now, summer was almost over. In a week, the pumpkin would be full grown and start turning yellowish and then orange. A few weeks after that, it would be ripe and ready for the pumpkin contest. Clayton could hardly wait. The pumpkin was growing so fast, it would soon be larger than his house. Then he had a terrible thought. If the pumpkin was so big, how would he get it to the contest? It wouldn't fit in his red wagon. It wouldn't even fit in a truck. Clayton decided to worry about that when the time came. That night the weather grew colder. Thinking there might be an early frost, Clayton rushed out to the pumpkin with his blanket. One was not enough. Soon he was rushing back and forth, carrying all the blankets from the house. As he worked, he hummed a little song. And as he hummed, he heard someone else singing. He also began to realize that someone else was covering the pumpkin with blankets. Desmond, too, had seen the danger of an early frost. He, too, had brought blankets for the pumpkin. And as he worked, he sang a little song. Jack-o'-lantern, jack-o'-lantern, you are such a funny sight. And as he sang, he began to realize that someone else was working and humming. Clayton stopped humming. He put down his pile of blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. Desmond stopped singing. He put down his blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. The two of them bumped heads and fell down. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Clayton. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Desmond. "That's why it got so big," said Clayton. "That's why it got so big," said Desmond. They burst out laughing. When everything had been explained, Clayton said, "I know I'll win the contest if I can get the pumpkin to town." Desmond smiled. "I'll help you. Just let me carve the pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween when the contest is over." "It's a deal," said Clayton. "A deal," said Desmond, and they shook on it. The morning of the contest was bright and sunny. Mice were bringing their pumpkins to the town square by truck and car and wagon, and some were rolling them along the ground. Suddenly they all stopped short. Over the fields came the biggest pumpkin anyone had ever seen. It was being pulled by 100 field mice on motorcycles. When the pumpkin reached town, it was too big for any of the streets. Clayton had to explain why they couldn't bring it to the square. The mayor understood at once. He led the crowd to the giant pumpkin and pinned the first prize ribbon on its side. Then everyone danced around it. "Who would have believed this?" said Clayton as he danced. "Who would have believed this?" said Desmond at the same moment. When the celebration was over, the 100 field mice pulled the pumpkin back to the field. The day before Halloween, they carved it into the best jack-o'-lantern ever. And on Halloween night, its wonderful smiling face could be seen glowing for miles around. And that's the end of The Biggest Pumpkin Ever by Stephen Kroll, illustrated by Jenny Bassett. Our next poem, boys and girls, is called Harvest Hues. Hue is another word for color. So this poem is all about the colors we see during harvest time in the fall. As you read along with me, this poem will help you recognize the color words. I hope you enjoy Harvest Hues. Harvest Hues. Red is the color for the apples we bake. Brown is the color for the leaves we rake. Yellow is the color for the hay in the barn. Purple is the color for a sweater's yarn. Orange is the color for a pumpkin pie. Black is the color for the nighttime sky. Blue is the color for a pair of jeans. Fall marks the end of meadows green. Our next story, boys and girls, is called The Pumpkin Patch, Story and Photographs by Elizabeth King. This book is a non-fiction book. That means that the text is all facts. I hope you enjoy learning all about how pumpkins grow in this story, The Pumpkin Patch by Elizabeth King. The Pumpkin Patch, Story and Photographs by Elizabeth King. The Pumpkin Patch, Story and Photographs by Elizabeth King. For my father, James C. King, who led the way with a silver sunbeam. It is autumn. The days are cool and crisp. The wind rustles the cornstalks and shakes the leaves from the trees. Down the dusty road in the pumpkin patch, the pumpkins are round and ripe. They are ready to be picked. This pumpkin patch is part of a large vegetable farm. The farmer grows peppers, corn, and squash. Pumpkins are a type of squash. A lot of work was done in the pumpkin patch before the pumpkins were ready to be picked and carved into Halloween jack-o'-lanterns. Work begins in July. The farmer prepares the soil in his fields for the pumpkin seeds. First, a plow slices and turns over the earth. Next, the ground is smoothed by a machine. Then straight rows are marked in the fields. A crew of workers plants the pumpkin seeds in the rows. With a hoe, a man digs a hole in the ground. Another man drops a couple of seeds in the hole and then covers the seeds with earth. Pumpkin seeds come from inside pumpkins. The seeds are creamy white in color. But the seeds the farmer buys from the seed company have been coated with a pink powder. This chemical keeps the seeds from being eaten by underground insects after the seeds are planted. Under the warm earth, the seeds begin to sprout. After a week, 2 leaves appear where each seed was planted. These first leaves are called seed leaves. Next, pumpkin vine leaves appear. These leaves are a different shape. They have jagged edges and feel prickly. The leaves grow quickly. The pumpkin plants have been placed far enough apart to leave room for the pumpkin vines to spread. Before the plants get too big, the farmer weeds between the rows. Weeds take away water and food from the growing pumpkin plants. More new leaves grow. Stems grow too. The stems twist and crawl along the ground as they become vines. Curly tendrils appear on the vines. They wrap themselves around other parts of the plant to help the vines spread. The vines become thick and strong. Soon they will be long enough to touch one another between the rows. The leaves look like big hands covering the earth. Meanwhile, flowers begin to bloom on the vines. Some of the pumpkin flowers sit on top of the green bulbs. These little bulbs will swell beneath the flowers. They are baby pumpkins. With the water and sunlight, the little green pumpkins grow bigger and bigger. The pumpkins are hard to find among the leaves because they are the same color. But they do not stay hidden for long. The pumpkin skins slowly turn from green to orange. By the middle of October, the pumpkins are plump and orange all over. They are ready to be picked. First, the workers cut the vines to untangle them. Then they cut the stems from the pumpkins with big shears. The farmer's family decorates the farm stand for Halloween. They place pumpkins all around on the soft straw. They hope customers will want to stop at the stand with the Wicked Witch, the Scarecrow, and the papier-mâché pumpkin that is big enough to walk into. There are piles and piles of pumpkins that have been grown on the farm. They come in different sizes and different shapes. Some have smooth skins. Others have big bumps. Some are big and some are little. Children come to the patch to pick out their pumpkins. They see and touch the pumpkins. They roll them on the ground and hold them up. This squash makes a great crown. This pumpkin is round and smooth, with a good strong stem for the lid of a jack-o'-lantern. When he sells his pumpkins, the farmer's work is done for the year. Now it's time for the children to take their pumpkins home and carve them. With a candle inside, the pumpkin glows on Halloween night. Ghosts and goblins, beware! And that is the end of The Pumpkin Patch, Story and Photographs by Elizabeth King. Our final poem today, boys and girls, is called Magic Vine. It's all about how a pumpkin grows. It's amazing to me that you put a little seed in the ground and it will grow into something wonderful, almost enchanted. I hope you enjoy Magic Vine. Magic Vine, author unknown. A fairy seed I planted, so dry and white and old, there sprang a vine enchanted with magic flowers of gold. I watched it, I tended it, and truly by and by, it bore a jack-o'-lantern and a great Thanksgiving pie. Our final story today, boys and girls, is called Pumpkin Jack. It's written and illustrated by Will Hubble. It's a wonderful story about a boy named Tim who carves a face in a pumpkin to make a jack-o'-lantern, and he names his jack-o'-lantern Jack. I hope you enjoy Pumpkin Jack. Pumpkin Jack, written and illustrated by Will Hubble. Pumpkin Jack, written and illustrated by Will Hubble. When Tim carved his first pumpkin, it was fierce and funny and just perfect. A jack-o'-lantern this good deserved a name, so Tim gave it one, Jack. Long after the best trick-or-treat candy was eaten, Tim still kept Jack. At night, when a candle made Jack's face dance on the wall and filled the dark with warm pumpkin smells, Tim felt Jack was almost magic. Yet, too soon, the spell was broken. "This pumpkin is beginning to rot," announced Mom. "It's time to throw it out." Tim knew it was useless to argue. He carried Jack to the garden, which was filled with the brown ghosts of last summer's plants. "A dead garden is better than a trash can," thought Tim. Still, it made him sad to leave Jack outside and alone. Whenever chores or play brought Tim to the garden, he looked at Jack. Every time, Jack was different. He became wrinkled and his fierce smile began to look silly. Mold spread over Jack's bright orange skin. As the days turned colder, Jack grew flatter. Winter began. Soon Jack was hidden beneath snow, and Tim forgot about him. The cold, heavy jacket days came. Snowman and sliding days, indoor days, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Valentine's. When all these days had passed and the March winds melted the snow, Tim found Jack. There wasn't much left, just a faded and crumpled pumpkin skin, a stem, and a few seeds. Jack's Halloween magic was a distant memory now. Tim scraped a thin blanket of earth over the last bits of his pumpkin. "Goodbye, Jack," he whispered. When spring turned barefoot warm, a tiny sprout appeared where Jack had been. Tim found it and guessed what it was. In the days that followed, Tim weeded and watered and watched the sprout. Slowly and steadily, the plant changed and grew. It branched and spread a web of vines over the ground, but no pumpkins appeared. The days turned hot. Flowers opened on the plant each morning, yellow stars that twisted shut forever in the afternoon. Still, there were no pumpkins. Finally, Tim found a little green ball growing behind a crumpled blossom. A pumpkin! Tim let out a whoop and ran to show his mom. By August, the plant had spilled onto the lawn. Tim's favorite game became pumpkin hunting. He carefully waded among the leaves, searching for green pumpkins like hidden treasures. School began again, and the days cooled. Tim had less time to visit the garden. When he did, the pumpkin plant seemed tired. There were few new leaves, and the old tattered ones no longer hid the fat green pumpkins. Then, one October morning, Tim woke to see frost coating the garden. The frozen plants seemed changed to pale blue grass. After school, Tim discovered what the frost had done. The pumpkin plant's leaves were as limp as wet paper. It was dying. Tim searched among the withered leaves for the unripe pumpkins. He picked them and put them on the front porch, hoping for one more change. By Halloween, the pumpkins had ripened to bright orange. There were many, for the plant had been generous. Tim was generous too. He gave away all but one. From jack-o'-lantern to seed to pumpkin again, the circle was almost complete. Now it was time for Tim to do his part. He gave his pumpkin a face. It smiled at him in a fierce and funny way. Tim smiled too and said, "Welcome back, Jack." And that is the end of Pumpkin Jack, written and illustrated by Will Hubble. I've had so much fun being with you today, boys and girls, and I hope you enjoyed all of the stories and poems about pumpkins. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, you can do so by pushing the little red button. It's free, and you'll get all of the latest videos with stories and poems from Reading with Mrs. Adams. One truth I want you always to remember, and that is that God loves you so much. So dare to dream the impossible, because all things are possible with God. Until next time, boys and girls, goodbye.